So chapter 5 builds a little bit on chapter 4 in that the purpose of chapter 5 is to further investigate how infants are piecing apart words out of sentences. But interestingly, our intuition is that the material from chapter 5 should build directly on the material from chapter 4, because if infants are piecing apart little snippets of sound, little segments of sound out of a stream of more complex sounds in chapter 4, then all we're doing in chapter 5 is attaching meaning to those little sets of sounds that we've extracted already in chapter 4. But really our intuition isn't correct about that. We assume that that's how babies do it, but there's any number of other possible things that babies are doing. For instance, babies may be assuming that our speech is no different from learning sequences of music or tones. And it's also possible that that babies are just processing, that they're just learning these sequences of sounds but not attaching meaning to them, that they're attaching meaning to something else. And there's some evidence to suggest this, as we detailed in chapter 3. There was a section about the segmentation of the dorsal and ventral streams in both visual recognition and also auditory recognition. Basically, these two streams are the processing of sound patterns and the processing of word recognition. And some people can have damage to one and not the other, so they can continue to process all kinds of complicated speech and tone patterns, but they still can't recognize a word unit. And so that suggests that there's a possibility that these two processes, the one described in chapter 4 and the one described in chapter 5, are actually mediated in different parts of the brain and don't necessarily, in infants, build on each other. So one way that, I guess an additional piece of evidence that suggests that this may be the case is that the material discussed in chapter 4 describes a very precise process. Infants are marvelously good at piecing apart very distinct and perfect sound distinctions that as adults we have very poor abilities to piece apart. They can hear the differences between all different kinds of sounds, even those sounds that as an adult we hear and can't tell the difference between. They can hear voiced versus voiceless. They can hear aspirated versus unaspirated. They can hear the difference between things that for us are just allophones. They can hear the difference between phonemes. And what I mean by those things are, as you read in chapter 4, allophones are sounds that we don't hear a distinction between, but we treat them as the same letter, even though we might pronounce them differently in some contexts. One obvious example of this is that sometimes at the end of a word, we add the letter S to make it plural. This S can be pronounced S or Z as an S or a Z, depending on the word that it's been attached to. Cats and dogs. The S at the end of dogs is pronounced as a voiced consonant, so it sounds like a Z. But the S at the end of the word cats is unvoiced, so it sounds like an S. That's an example of an allophone. We treat it as the same letter. We don't recognize a distinction between them, but infants are very tuned to these minute differences, like the difference in the S at the end of cats and dogs. So we see that infants are very good, very attuned to these differences in sound patterns in chapter 4, but when we look at the material in chapter 5, we notice that infants aren't really that great at distinguishing sound patterns. We'll start here on page 148 with an example. Here we have introduced the switch task. This is an experimental paradigm that is presented to infants and allows us to see what differences infants hear when trying to learn a new word, like the name of an object. So an object, as you see in figure 5.1 on page 149, an object is shown on the screen and it's called something. speaker, like a loudspeaker, is repeating the word lif, 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 over and over again as it presents this picture to the infants. Eventually they lose interest. That's called the habituation phase. They stop looking at the picture and they stop paying attention to the word. After that occurs, researchers make a switch for the test phase. They either continue in some conditions, they continue to say the same word, lif, lif, or they switch to a new word, neem, neem. And when the switch occurs, in the conditions that it occurs, so it doesn't always occur, but in those conditions when it occurs, the infants all of a sudden gain renewed interest. It's as if they recognize, oh, this is incongruent with what I previously learned. This is a different word with the same picture. So they might look for differences in the picture. They might listen for differences in the word. They might look for contextual cues to see if there's a reason why the word switched. The interesting thing here is, as you see in the graph in panel B of that same figure, if you start the infant with one word, like be, with a B as in Bob, be, 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 and then you switch to de with a D, that alone appears to be insufficient to regain the infant's interest. So when the difference between the words is very small, then infants seem to not differentiate that this is a different word for that picture. In chapter 4, you saw that infants were incredibly good at distinguishing these different sounds. So certainly they must be hearing the difference between be and de. Phonologically, there's a big difference, and infants are most certainly hearing it. But when they treat it as a word, it appears that infants aren't really that great at distinguishing between the two. It's as if they have big bins, and they throw in similar words into the bin. And if it sounds approximate, if it's close enough, then they just treat it as the same word, even though they hear differences in the way the word's being said. And this is actually a really adaptive strategy that infants use, because you can imagine in some languages, we use sounds interchangeably, and we ignore minute differences that infants are actually attuned to. We say words differently sometimes, and if an infant were to distinguish every tiny little difference that we aren't aware of when we speak, as if it were a different word, then infants wouldn't be able to learn language. They have to be able to group similar sounds in some way. So when they do this, when they go through this process of learning a new word, they sometimes might treat be and de as the same word if it's attached to the same picture, because it might be an adaptive strategy to them to realize that adults speaking this language aren't particular about be and de, the differences in the sounds there. That is, until it becomes important. At some point, infants might realize that the difference between as we see in the chapter, bean and dean, or bad and dad, or bot and dot, those might be important differences. In fact, we have different words that mean totally different things depending on whether we use a B or a D at the beginning of the word. And so at some point, when the infant realizes that this is an actually meaningful distinction, then they'll begin to separate these bins. They'll make smaller bins, and they won't throw arbitrarily as many things into the same bin. They'll become more distinguishing. But at first, until they learn where the boundaries of these bins should be, then they just they're pretty big, and they just throw any similar thing in there. Now, on a related topic, if we skip ahead to page 164, we see a little box here revisiting the switch task. You see, the switch task started out as our best way of understanding how infants process new words, but it has a significant problem, and that problem is that there was no communicative intent established. As you know from the reading, a communicative intent is an obvious way that an adult speaker demonstrates that they are intending, their meaning, to communicate something to the infant. That it's not arbitrary, that it's not just random noises coming out of their mouth, but that rather, by, for instance, making eye contact or using other kinds of body language, looking at the object, looking back at the child, that there's some obvious way for the infant to see that this adult is trying to communicate something to me. His intent is to communicate. And if you think about the original switch task, it didn't have the intent to communicate. It was just a picture with an auditory word being spoken over a loudspeaker. So some researchers, some really clever researchers, made two conditions of the switch task. Before the switch task began, they showed a series of pictures of common things that they thought they were pretty confident that the infant would know what they were. Like, for instance, they showed a picture of a car and said, car. They showed a picture of a kitty and the loudspeaker said, kitty. They had another condition in which they showed pictures like a car, like a kitty, and they said things instead of naming, like wow or wee or cool, right? When they said exclamations about the picture that were not the name of the picture, then infants didn't realize that there was any intention to communicate about the pictures. So when new words like biff or liff or deem or neem were presented at a later time about some new object that they'd never seen before, the infants didn't learn from it. They didn't care about it because they assumed that these new words were not intending to communicate a title or a name. Rather, they assumed that they were just intending to communicate, that's cool, wow, who knew, woo woo, whatever, right? So, but we find the opposite is true. When the infants were presented with pictures in connection with words like car and kitty, then when new pictures were presented and there were new words matched with those pictures, then infants took that as an intent to communicate. They knew that there was a connection between the words being spoken and the pictures being shown. And they knew then, because of the previous ones, the pictures they already knew and the words they already knew, when they saw pictures later on they weren't familiar with and heard words they weren't familiar with, they knew that that was a word that meant this picture. And so they took that as an intent to communicate, and they learned better in those conditions. And the crux of the matter comes down to this. Unlike what we saw earlier in the chapter, where biff and diff were not differentiated, in this situation, biff and diff were differentiated. The infants, after the switch was made from bi to di, after the switch was made, the infants noticed it. They started paying attention again. They looked longer at the picture to see if there were differences, what the contextual cues were. They wanted to figure out why there was a switch in the word. That suggests that without communicative intent in the switch task, we were making an assumption that all that was important in learning a new word was an association between the picture and the word. The picture and the word over and over again. But that is not the most important thing in learning a new word. For infants, the thing they care most about is communicative intent. They care to know that you mean to tell them the name of an object. And if they can see that that's what you're meaning to do, then they'll care to learn.